Okay, so I'd like to welcome you to this Center for Mindful Eating free webinar entitled Get Stressed, Eat, Repeat, Why Eating Becomes Habit with Dr. Judson Brewer. As I said, my name is Stephen. I'll be your host. Thank you for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly give you some background about the Center for Mindful Eating. TCME was created for professionals who want to learn about the value of mindfulness and mindful eating. The Center for Mindful Eating does not promote or advocate one single approach to mindful eating. Rather, we are committed to sharing ideas and practices, clinical experience, and research. For our members, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for your support and membership. Without you, we wouldn't be here. We have numerous resources available to you as a member. These are all on our website. They include a full archive of talks, publications, networking opportunities, and more. If you need assistance accessing your TCME resources, please contact us at info@tcme.org. All of our members who attend today will be eligible to receive one CPE issued from Skelly Skills. These are approved for registered dietitians. A short survey will be emailed to you following the presentation where you can obtain your certificate. As you know, the Center for Mindful Eating is a nonprofit organization that is member supported. Your membership not only provides an extensive list of benefits, but also helps to support our free programs that are open to the public, such as today's, and help us to meet our mission of providing educational resources to learn more about the practices and benefits of mindful eating. Thank you for being a part of the Center for Mindful Eating. And now I am delighted to introduce Dr. Judson Brewer, who will be presenting Get Stressed, Eat, Repeat, Why Eating Becomes Habit. Judson Brewer, MD, PhD, is the Director of Research at the Center for Mindfulness and Associate Professor in Medicine and Psychiatry at UMass Medical School. He is also adjunct faculty at Yale University and a research affiliate at MIT. A psychiatrist and internationally known expert in mindfulness training for addictions, Dr. Brewer has developed and tested novel mindfulness programs for addictions such as smoking and stress eating, including both in-person and app-based treatments. Now I'm going to turn the webinar over to Dr. Brewer. This program is being recorded and will be available following the presentation. Dr. Brewer, thank you for joining us today.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. It's great to be here. Just a little bit of organizational bits. I'll give a presentation for about 25 to 30 minutes where we'll talk about how we set up stress eating habits, and then leave plenty of time at the end so that we can have a discussion about this to make sure that it's understandable and you can even have some bite-sized pieces to take home. So why don't we go ahead and get started. As Stephen mentioned, this is a view from my office in the winter, obviously, where my job at the Center for Mindfulness is to investigate the mind to improve well-being and realize human potential. So it's a really great opportunity as well as a responsibility for us here at the Center for Mindfulness to really think through how we can best help people change habits, which is at the heart of a lot of these issues. I thought I could start with a brief case presentation with a patient that I saw in my clinic who I've seen probably over the last 2 years. This woman is about 30 years old and is of Southeast Asian origin. She was born actually in the refugee camps in Cambodia when her parents were under the Khmer Rouge regime. They were fortunate enough to be able to immigrate to the U.S. where they started a life here. And around the age of 8, this young woman's mother started let's just say not treating her particularly kindly from an emotional perspective, and was probably taking out some of her own stress on her daughter. And as a way to cope, this young woman started eating. And in particular, when I saw her, she was around the age of 30, so she'd been doing this for about 20 years. And what she described to me was that she would eat pizza as a way to block out unpleasant thoughts or emotions, as a way to numb herself. Eventually, she got to the point where she could eat an entire pizza in one sitting and would binge on pizzas sometimes two to three times a day, and could do this for up to 30 days in a row before she would be able to break this cycle for a few minutes or a few days and then restart the cycle again. By the time I saw her, she was pretty obese and coming for help to help control her eating. I think we've all probably seen folks like this, or even can relate to some degree. And in fact, I think what this woman was looking for, she was trying to get through eating. So how does this get set up? This is a Weight Watchers commercial that was aired around the year 2014. It's about 1 minute long, and I'll just play this for everyone.
If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad because you're angry, feeling down, or generally bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're bored and you know it, eat a snack. If you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're guilty and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
So I love this commercial because I think the Weight Watchers folks really nailed it in terms of how these eating habits get formed. Now, we probably evolved to remember where nutritious food is, where it is and when to find it, and also as a way to avoid danger on our way to find this nutritious food. In fact, there's a lot of research that's been shown now that we learn to do all sorts of unhealthy behavioral habits, and I'm using smoking and eating here as two examples, through what's described as positive and negative reinforcement. Most of us have probably learned this in high school or beginning courses in college, because this is a very, very evolutionarily conserved process that is known all the way back to the earliest or the least evolved of the nervous systems, such as the sea slug, which only has 20,000 neurons. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize, showing that the sea slug learns in the same way that the mouse or the rat or the pigeon learns. B.F. Skinner became famous for doing work in animal behaviorism in the 50s. And of course, humans learn in a very similar way. As you can see from this diagram, just simply put, we see something that looks good, some good food. Our brain says that looks good. Why don't we eat that? So we eat it, and then we learn, oh, that was a good thing. And we learn to reinforce this, so next time we see good food that looks good, our brain already starts to move toward it. In the same way as the Weight Watchers commercial was showing, when we're not feeling so good, our brain says, well, why don't you do something to make yourself feel better? So we eat a cupcake or we smoke a cigarette, and we also learn, oh, you can make those unpleasant things go away by eating or smoking or doing other unhealthy behaviors. These also increase the salience of future cues so that they become more gripping, or they grab us more in the future as well. And I'm just showing here at the bottom of the slide all of the different, just some examples of a number of different publications that have really helped us understand this process, all the way back to the late 1800s, where Edward Thorndike published his first papers with dogs, cats, and other animals on this. Now, it's interesting because the first thing that we need to understand to be able to treat a behavior is how it gets set up. So it's really critical that we understand this positive and negative reinforcement process and how it's different than things like physiologic hunger, so that we can start to work with these without having unintended consequences. As an example, I'm an addiction psychiatrist, and the field understands this process, positive and negative reinforcement, and uses it as a way to help develop treatments. Just as an example, in Alcoholics Anonymous, there's this phrase, people, places, and things. So if we avoid cues, such as people, places, and things, we're less likely to be drawn in to use drugs or drink alcohol, for example. So that makes sense. If you can block the seeing or smelling or tasting or being with people that drink, then we're less likely to drink. With smoking, it's a little harder to do because we learn to smoke on our front porch, outside of work, in our car on the way to work. So we say, okay, well, let's substitute a behavior. Why don't you eat some candy or some carrot sticks instead of smoking so you can treat around the problem? Now, unfortunately, neither of these strategies dismantle this core loop. You can see in these orange arrows here, this core loop is still intact. Avoidance of cues can help a little bit. Substitute behaviors can help a little bit, but neither of them dismantle the loop itself. And of course, as we know with eating, we don't have to drink alcohol to survive. We don't have to smoke cigarettes to survive, but we do have to eat to survive. So it becomes even more complicated when we eat. Now, it's interesting, the Buddhist psychologists described this process 2,500 years ago. They termed it dependent origination, and they linked 12 steps in this process that I'll show in a simplified version here. So if we think of the Weight Watchers commercial, you know, we see something that makes us unhappy. Our brain says, oh, that doesn't feel very good. Make it go away. So we have this urge to make it go away. We do a behavior such as eating a cupcake. We feel better. And then this reinforces this process so that we are more likely to do it in the future. The Buddhist psychologists describe this in terms of pleasant and unpleasant. Both the pleasant things lead to cravings, unpleasant things lead to cravings. The pleasant things lead to us craving for that pleasant to continue. The unpleasant leads for us to crave for those unpleasant things to go away, and then we behave accordingly. Now, they describe this in terms of a birth of a self-identity, which in modern day we describe as memory. When we wake up in the morning, we look in the mirror and say, yep, that's me, based on our memories from the previous day. Now, in modern days, or I should say in the old times, they described that this process was perpetuated through what they called ignorance. Now, I'm using some glasses here to portray ignorance because in modern day we call this subjective bias, in the sense that every time we learn to do a behavior, it changes the way we see the world, so we're more likely to see the world through those glasses in the future. So if we eat chocolate, it tastes good. We start to see the world through I like chocolate glasses. And so if I bomb on an exam or I get yelled at by my boss, my chocolate glasses say, hey, I know how to cheer you up, eat some chocolate. Now, of course, we know that eating chocolate doesn't actually help us study more, per se, or it doesn't help us, our relationship with our boss. And this is what the Buddhists described. They said that this process just gets perpetuated the more we do it over and over and over. And they actually called it samsara, which probably many of you are familiar with. Literally translated, the term samsara means endless wandering, because we'll endlessly wander through this loop, and we'll actually reinforce these habits without actually fixing the core processes that are underlying our problems in the first place. And they really emphasize this sense of self, where we get identified with certain behaviors as really perpetuating the process. Now, there's Alan Watts is a philosopher, and I think he described it nicely. He said, ego, the self which he has believed himself to be, is nothing but a pattern of habits. And interestingly, the Buddhist psychologists described this process. They said there's really a core piece here that we need to pay attention to, which is craving. So as you can read from here, they said, just as a tree, though cut down, can grow again and again if its roots are undamaged and strong, in the same way, if the roots of craving are not wholly uprooted, sorrows will come again and again. Now, I like this modern-day interpretation a little bit better. I think we all get the idea here. So what is it about craving, and what is it about this habit loop that perpetuates itself so much, and what can we learn from this so we can start to treat it? Now, the food industry has gotten involved here. We can see all sorts of foods. Here's an example. A friend took this picture for me. We see addictive granola. We see McDonald's flaunting it. You know, they have billboards saying crafted for your craving. Kellogg's has gotten into the fray. They've got Crave cereal, and if milk chocolate Crave isn't good enough, don't worry, there's double chocolate Crave. And I think we probably are all here together today because we know where this leads. Now, it's interesting for those of you that haven't seen this article from the New York Times from a few years ago. They really did this expose where they described how the food industry takes great pains to develop food that is optimally formulated to have this ratio of salt to fat, a crunch, a pleasing feel in the mouth, and a taste that all lead to addiction. I think this describes it nicely. You know, ideally, the more they can get us to eat food, the more they're going to profit from it. So this brings us to why I'm here today. When we can understand these processes, then we can start to develop strategies to work with them. And this is where mindfulness comes in. So just a little bit of my background. I started meditating actually at the beginning of medical school back in the 90s. And I was studying molecular biology. My PhD was actually in immunology, and I was looking at why we get sick when we get stressed out. And in the meantime, I was just practicing meditation and mindfulness on my own, and I was starting to learn how I could start to notice getting caught up in my own habits and how I could use mindfulness to step out of them. By the time I finished my MD PhD program and started residency training, I had decided to shift my career to studying humans, doing neuroscience and clinical studies to see how mindfulness could actually help us change our unhealthy behaviors. Now, for those of you, I'm sure everybody's familiar with this working definition that Jon Kabat-Zinn has developed, and he, as the founder of the Center for Mindfulness, wrote this in his book, Full Catastrophe Living, close to decades ago. Paying attention in the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. One way to think about this is we're paying attention to what's happening, but if you think back to that habit loop, we're not getting sucked into those pleasant things, and we're not pushing away those unpleasant things. We're just being with those sensations, pleasant and unpleasant, as they arise, and not getting carried away by them. And if you think about this from a habit loop perspective, the description that we often use is where we're driving a wedge of awareness into this process where we can notice those urges to act so that we can actually step out of them. At least that's the theory. And that was a theory that we could actually test now that we could understand where some of these habit loops were set up. Now, many of you are familiar with the literature, the emerging literature in mindfulness. It's actually relatively young. Most of the papers, there were very, very few papers published before the year 2000. I'm just highlighting a couple of examples where there have been reproducible results in major areas. For example, with anxiety, depression has a lot of good studies behind it, especially around mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. Jon Kabat-Zinn published his first paper with chronic pain patients back in the 80s. We've done a lot of work with addiction. Some have even shown that it can boost the immune system. And I throw this in at the bottom because it's pretty funny. But you can boost your. It's crazy if you train graduate students to pay attention, they actually do better on exams. Brilliant. So we can see how mindfulness-based treatments have been shown are emerging as a modality to treat a number of different maladies. But the real question is, how well do they work, and how do they work? What's the mechanism behind mindfulness? So we sought to study this in our second clinical study with mindfulness training. The first one we'd done was with alcohol and cocaine dependence. We found that it was equivalent to cognitive behavioral therapy in terms of preventing relapse to use, and was actually better when people were psychologically stressed out. They responded more appropriately to psychological, as well as their physiology changed when we gave them a psychological stress. So we then moved on to working with smoking cessation to see if we could actually help people quit smoking. And what we told people to do in this randomized control trial, we didn't even tell them they were getting mindfulness training. So we brought them into the group. They had no idea what they were getting, and then we told them to smoke. And they looked at us like we were crazy. They were coming here for smoking cessation, yet we were telling them to smoke. Yet we put one twist on this, and probably most, if not all of you, are familiar with the now famous raisin exercise. We basically had them do a raisin exercise with their cigarettes, to go outside, smoke, and pay attention as they smoked. And the paradox here, it seems, how is paying attention actually going to help us change these unhealthy habits? Well, I'll give you an example of what we see all the time with these folks. This one person wrote in her journal, she said, mindful smoking, it smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. Now, the critical piece here that I'm pointing out is we didn't tell her that smoking was bad for her. She already knew that. That's why she came to our clinic and was trying to quit smoking. And in the same way, people know that overeating or eating a bunch of junk food is not good for them, yet the problem is that they keep doing it. Now, one of the difficulties here is that the prefrontal cortex, that youngest part of our brain from an evolutionary perspective, it goes offline when we get stressed out. So when we need that cognitive control the most, it's not there to help us. So what can we do when that part of our brain is not available for us? Well, we can start to train those older parts of our brains, evolutionarily speaking, to start to see clearly what they're actually getting from their behavior. And like this woman pointed out, she started to see that cigarettes didn't actually taste that good. And when she saw that, she started to become disenchanted with her behavior, which set her on the way to quitting smoking. Now, we'll circle back to this with eating in a little bit, because as we know, we don't have to smoke to survive, but yet we do have to eat. Yet the same principle applies, and we'll talk about that in a bit. So I like this quote from Yogi Berra. He says, you can observe a lot just by watching. I think that's really true, and that's what we were seeing in our clinical studies. Now, we wanted to take this one step farther and ask ourselves, well, what's actually going on mechanistically? Because if we can understand the mechanisms underlying this, we can then start applying these to other behaviors, such as stress and emotional eating. I won't go through the details because we published this now about 5 years ago. We found that mindfulness training was twice as good as gold standard therapy, in this case, the American Lung Association's Freedom from Smoking, in helping people quit smoking at the end of treatment, which was 4 weeks long, 8 sessions, and also they had maintained their gains 4 months later, whereas the folks in the Freedom from Smoking group had slipped a bit. Now, these were pretty strong data. We weren't expecting to see these results quite so robustly, so we then started looking mechanistically what was going on. And our hypothesis was that mindfulness training would work by decoupling craving and behavior. Now, this wasn't a new hypothesis. We were just borrowing the hypothesis from the Buddhist psychologists and testing their hypothesis. So the prediction would be that we should see a dissociation between craving and smoking before they both subsided, i.e., if you think of craving as a fire, and that fire is burning based on the fuel that we feed it, say as smoking cigarettes, if we stop smoking, that fuel is not going to magically go out, poof, it's just going to start to burn down over time as that residual fuel is consumed. And we can actually test this mathematically. I won't go through all the details. If you're interested, you can look at the published paper. What we found was at the beginning of treatment, as others had found, that there's a strong correlation between craving and smoking. The more you crave, the more you smoke. Now, at the end of treatment, just 4 weeks later, that association was completely gone. People craved, but they didn't necessarily smoke. When we did moderation analyses where we could look to see what was actually moderating that dissociation between craving and smoking, it turned out that it wasn't dependent on baseline craving, it wasn't dependent on cigarette use, it wasn't dependent on treatment craving. You can see these beta weights if you're not familiar with the math here. We're looking for a large number in the beta category, and we're looking for a very small number in the P category, meaning suggesting that it has statistical significance. What we found was that informal mindfulness practices, in-the-moment practice that people were using to write out their cravings, actually moderated the dissociation between craving and smoking. It was a very, very strong predictor of the effect. Now, interestingly, this effect size was very strong, so things over 0.5, 0.8, things over 0.8 are considered very large. This is over 1, which is considered a very large effect size. Interestingly, we found that formal mindfulness practices such as sitting meditation, breath awareness, body scan were somewhat associated with outcomes, but not nearly as strongly as these informal practices. If we actually look at the raw data, because we can fool ourselves quite a bit through doing statistics, we can see at the end of treatment that the amount of craving that people had, whether they quit smoking or didn't quit smoking, was exactly the same. Yet over time, the people that quit smoking, their cravings died down just as predicted, whereas those that didn't quit, their cravings were maintained. Now you can see that their cravings hadn't gone quite up to the beginning because these folks were still only smoking about half the cigarettes they had when they came in for treatment. And if we bring it back to our diagram mechanistically, it does seem that the mindfulness training is driving this wedge between the craving and the smoking behavior and formally breaking this link, which in essence should lead to long-term outcomes, and that's what we were seeing. So I'm emphasizing this because it's really important to understand mechanistically what's going on so that we can target our training so that it's very focused to help people work with their cravings if that's where the effects are happening so that they can have long-lasting effects. So this is where we said, okay, these treatments were, seem to be working pretty well in person. How can we disseminate this? Now, one of my colleagues at Yale, Kathy Carroll, was studying the dissemination of evidence-based treatments, for example, with cognitive behavioral therapy and motivational interviewing. And she did a large study through the Clinical Trials Network and actually found that therapists who knew that they were getting videotaped, knew they were part of a study, and all of this were actually not delivering manualized therapy that they were trained to deliver. She was very dismayed by this and decided to turn to online-based training so that she could maintain 100% fidelity with the cognitive behavioral therapy that she was delivering to make sure that therapists were actually delivering this as billed. Now, we took a cue from her and said, what if we could actually deliver this training where people are in their behaviors, at their worst. And with smokers, they go outside and they have a cigarette in one hand and they have their phone in their other hand. So we said, well, what if we can actually deliver this at the point of contact where they've actually developed these learned behaviors? So we developed this app called Craving to Quit, where we can take our manualized training and cut it into bite-sized pieces where they can get daily modules, 3 to 10 minutes a day, where they can learn these modules at the time that's best for them. They can go back and review them, and they have them at their fingertips so they can learn them in their own natural environment instead of having to come into their therapist's office on a certain day or night of the week and have all of the rigmarole that comes with that. We can also embed animations so that we can really drive the key points home. I'll give you an example of this in a minute. And we can also, importantly, provide in vivo exercises so that people can learn to mindfully smoke in the context where they've learned to absent-mindedly smoke. And we can also embed experience sampling so we can study the efficacy of this treatment. Importantly, we can go back to our data and look to see, okay, what was working in person, and we can embed that as a core piece of the training. So, for example, many of you are familiar with the acronym RAIM. So, recognize that that's a craving. Paradoxically, see if we're resisting the experience, because if we're really trying to push it away, we're not going to be able to work with it. So we encourage people to allow that experience to be there and then get really curious about it. So turn toward it and see what's actually happening in our body when we have a craving. So what's actually happening in my body right now? And then from moment to moment, we've modified what often is described in RAIN. We've taken the Mahasi Sayadaw noting practice and have train people to just note from moment to moment what these sensations actually feel like. And in the sense, if they're having a craving and it's made up of tightness, that tightness, instead of taking them for a ride, they can see, oh, that's tightness. Oh, there's tension, there's burning, there's mouth watering, and they can start to see that these are just body sensations, and instead of these body sensations taking them for a ride, they're simply experiences that they can be with as they come and go over time. Importantly, they learn to regain control of their body where habitually they're just acting out of habit, and instead can step back and see, oh, here's this urge. I can be with this urge, and then start to change their behavior accordingly. The other nice thing that we can do with app-based training is we can embed these right at that point of contact. We were finding in person that people were even forgetting the simple acronym, this RAIN exercise, so we can put it in what we jokingly call the panic button, so they can tap on their want-to meter, and it can help them ride out their urge right in that moment. And I'll give an example of this at the very end. We can also pair this with online communities where people can ask questions, they can get peer support, and they can even get expert-level support so that they can be much more likely to succeed. We know that from the literature that peer support has been shown to increase efficacy of these types of programs 3 to 4-fold. I'll just show you an example of how all of this is packaged in a single app, because it might seem kind of strange that you could deliver a manualized treatment at your fingertips, whether it's through a phone or a tablet.
Welcome to Craving to Quit, a 3-week program that will help you quit smoking. This training, delivered live at Yale University, has been shown to be twice as effective as other quit smoking therapies. Now I'll walk you through the basic idea about how habits are formed. First, recognize that the wanting or craving is coming on and relax into it.
And now I'll show you an example of how we can use animations as a way to really drive the key points home.
Today we're going to explain cravings through the metaphor of a screaming child. I know you've heard and seen a child throwing a tantrum. Perhaps for some of you, it was your own child. This child is screaming because he wants something. And you as the parent want him to stop screaming. All your child wants is a lollipop. So in this metaphor, think of your cravings as a child's tantrum. The lollipop is like the cigarettes. But what should you do? Yell at the child? That might make things worse. Gag the child? That will stop the screaming in the short term, but you know what will happen as soon as you take the gag away. You could just give him a lollipop. Congratulations! You just taught your child to scream for lollipops. In other words, you just taught him that screaming is a good way to get what he wants. What might you do instead? Here's a novel concept. Just let him scream himself out. What? Have you ever seen a child scream forever? Sometimes they scream so hard and so long that you think their head, or your head, might explode. But it never does. What happens instead? Eventually, the child gets tired and stops.
So here's just one example of a number of animations that we can embed into the program to help people really learn to develop mindfulness skills that they can use to write out their cravings. You know, interestingly, as we were developing this program, one of our pilot testers, just through reading the scripts that we were using to develop the program, reported that she was changing her eating habits. And that was a real eye-opener for us. We said, well, what's actually going on here? Because I hadn't been studying or interested even in studying eating behaviors at that point. When we started to look at this, this is when we started to see in the literature that there was a growing movement toward seeing links between eating behavior and addictions, where it affects the same dopaminergic pathway. Mice were preferring sugar over cocaine. A lot of the literature was suggesting that there was something that was really shared in common. And our patients were actually showing us this themselves. So at this point, and with a bit of prompting also from folks saying, hey, can you develop this for eating? About two to 3 years ago, we started shifting gears to develop an eating program that would help people in the same way that it was helping them, helping people quit smoking. We're calling this Eat Right Now, as in eat correctly in the present moment. And I can give folks a demo of this if there's some interest. But I'll just say we're in the middle of clinical trials now with the smoking cessation program as well as with the eating program. And the interesting thing that I'm really excited about right now is that we can also learn from higher education how best to deliver these therapeutic modalities. And what we're learning, and there was a study that just came out of the Mayo Clinic, I believe, within the last couple of weeks, suggesting that just delivering something online might not be as efficacious as delivering it online and also providing in-person support. So we look to what's described as a flipped classroom model that higher education's been using for a while, where lectures are delivered at home and homework is done in class. So for example, I have a friend in California who teaches at Cal Poly. He teaches physics. He's recorded all of his physics lectures, has his students watch those at home, and then they come to class to do their problem sets together where he can have perpetual office hours. And as you can imagine, just like we're seeing with our digital therapeutics, the people can watch these videos as many times as they want. They can go back to them. They can learn in their optimal environment. And at the same time, the facilitators for these groups can be freed up to not have to deliver a didactic, while they can have the time to then meet people with whatever's live for them at that point. So literally just last night we've started a flipped classroom here at the Center for Mindfulness where we have rolling admissions, people get an app-based training, and then they come in for weekly in-person sessions. So they can start the Eat Right Now training before they even come into class, and then they can get support wherever they are. Now, I just want to end there so that we have plenty of time for questions and discussion. I'm just putting a couple of things out here because I didn't talk about any of the neurobiology and any of the neuroscience work that we've done that links these habit loops in terms of behavior to the neurobiology. I gave a short talk at TED Med last fall that starts to link all of these things together. If you're interested, you can just go and search for my name at TED.com. The Center for Mindfulness has a number of resources. We try to post all of our research papers online so that folks can have access to them. Here's the link where you can go and access those papers. We published several papers recently on stress eating and mindfulness in particular, and also around mindfulness and the habit loop and the shared links between other addictions and eating. If you're interested in learning more about the Eat Right Now program, that will literally be launched sometime later this week or next week, and you can go to the eatrightnow.launchrock.com to get a sense or to get more information from that. So I'm just going to stop here and then give you a brief, just walk you through what that app looks like for those that are interested, and then we can open it up to questions. So let me just minimize this, and I'll show you. This is literally on my phone. This is the dashboard for the Eat Right Now program, and you can see at the bottom we have very similar features to our Craving to Quit program. So for example, with the Want-O-Meter, we can have people become aware of their cravings. They can rate those. They can say what triggered it. So let's say I was stressed out. And then we can have a recommended exercise, or there are other exercises if they'd rather not use the recommended one. So we suggest that they use RAIN in this case. It can walk them through it so that they can have it at their fingertips. They can either listen to a recording of it or just have the acronym right there at their fingertips. Other features that we've built into the app that are even part of, that were co-developed by our patients in the clinic who are saying, you know, I really can't differentiate stress from physiologic hunger. So we developed what we're calling the stress test. So if you click on the stress test, you can actually list a bunch of different symptoms. So if I feel overwhelmed, dizzy, I feel tense, I'm having difficulty concentrating. There are a lot of symptoms that can be symptoms of stress. They can also be symptoms of hunger as well. So we can have them click these off. We can algorithmically determine or weight these based on how long ago somebody ate. So let's say I just ate within the last hour. And then we can train people to start to differentiate these things. So if I feel overwhelmed, we can describe what this is like, and they can learn what it is. Stomach growling, for example, you know, that says feed me. This is a physiologic hunger signal. And then based on these, we can give them a suggestion on what to do. Now, since I listed a bunch of symptoms, our algorithm can't tell exactly what's going on, so it says, you know, you could be stressed, bored, or even hungry. Let's do a follow-up to figure out what's going on. So they can do this hunger stress test. They can help them differentiate whether they're hungry or not. if they're trying to lose weight or something, we can have them go through other exercises that will help them write out their cravings. And in this way, we can really help people learn to get these mindfulness skills and help them not only learn mindfulness but change their relationship to eating. There are a number of other features that I won't go through on this, and we also have an online community, just like I showed with the Craving to Quit program. Just see if this loads up quickly, where people can keep journals, they can comment on other people's posts, they can give them support along the way. So with that, I will stop here. We've got about 20 minutes, and I would be happy to take any questions from folks who are attending this webinar right now. And I think Stephen needs a few seconds to get that set up. So I know that there's the ability to raise your hand where you can ask a question verbally, or also type in a question and Stephen will read it to me.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Brewer. I see Jean has had her hand up for a while. Jean, I'm going to unmute you, and you can ask your question in person. Okay, Jean, you're ready to go.
You know, I didn't mean to raise my hand, but it looks like a really cool app. I'm quite impressed. I can't wait to fast forward a year and see what your data is actually like, because, as you said, eating is so much more complex than changing eating habits is more complex than changing smoking habits.
Right.
But you addressed, I was beginning to say, well, what about this and what about that? But you're addressing how do you tell the difference between hunger and other feelings. It really looks great.
Thank you, and we're really curious to see how it goes as well. We're also going to start collecting data on our flipped classroom model, because we think that that might be a really optimal way to support people to really change their eating habits. So yes, I share the enthusiasm. We're really curious to see how this works and what we can learn from it to make it and other types of programs even more efficacious. So thanks for the question.
Okay, so Anya, you're unmuted, and would you like to ask Dr. Brewer a question?
Yes, I would. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. I'm a psychotherapist who specializes in working with food and weight and obesity issues, and a lot of my clients are ACOAs, adult children of alcoholics. And my understanding is that often ACOAs have sugar sensitivity genetics similar to alcoholics, and if instead of doing alcohol, they're doing sugar or high glycemic carbs. And just that knowledge is profoundly helpful for people, that it's not their fault, that there's a component. I happened to stumble into AA and Zen Buddhism at the same time in 1978. I had the original DBT program, I think, and one of the pieces of that for me that's been really important is the peer piece. So I was really glad that you added that at the end. I think there's a relational heart component in all addiction, and if we're only going to work with ourselves and our mindfulness and our brains, something's missing for me. So I'm grateful that you guys are factoring in the connection piece, and I guess I'm hoping and wondering if you're going to do that even more.
Yeah, I think this is a really rich piece here, and the more we learn, the more we're learning what types of pieces people are looking for, and the more we can even individualize it so that we can help meet people where they're at. So some people feel so ashamed of what their body looks like or whatnot that they couldn't imagine going to a group.
Right.
So we can provide an online form where they can be anonymous. They can put an avatar of Cinderella, or they can be completely anonymous yet get that support that they need. For other people, they need a little bit more of a kick in the pants. This is what I was seeing in my psychiatric clinic with the patients that I was working with there. is, it's really helpful for them to be held accountable in person. And that's where we're starting to test with the flipped classroom model, ways to help people engaged in that way. So we're trying to provide all levels of care where we can really meet people where they're at. And I completely agree with you. I think a community is a really critical piece of this. And the question is, how can we provide the community that's going to be most helpful for somebody in this moment? And knowing that that community might even change for them over time. So if somebody starts to become comfortable in an online community, eventually they might feel comfortable going to a group community, knowing that they're going to have like-minded people where they couldn't even imagine that before. So I totally agree with you on that. We're really interested in looking at this, and I think it's a whole new area in terms of behavioral therapy in general, this flipped classroom model, just as an example.
Great. So we have Diane, who's had her hand up. Let me see if I can get you unmuted. Diane, you're unmuted. Would you like to ask Dr. Brewer a question? Diane? Okay. Let me try the next one. We have Sally, who's had her hand up. Sally, you're unmuted. Would you like to ask Dr. Brewer a question?
Yes, please. First off, wonderful presentation. I'm really excited about that app. I think it's something that's really needed. I'm a psychologist, and I work a lot with athletes, eating disorders, and often, as we know, those kind of go hand in hand. I generally work with late teens to about 35, and having an app is really helpful, or the future use of an app like this. So what I'm wondering is, in terms of the weekly sessions that you run, obviously it's you're going to be doing some research based around this use of this app. So, do you have a manual? Like, are you manualized in terms of the weekly sessions? Because when I look at this app and some of those clips you were showing, day one is learning how habits form. So, what are those sessions like? Are they primarily psychoeducation? If you can just kind of outline that for me.
So I'm smiling because this is where it gets really fun. So all of the psychoeducation is delivered literally through the app. So we give them these short bite-sized pieces that they can go back to and get animations and things like that, which really frees us up to be able to ask questions about where somebody tripped up. For example, let's say last night somebody described how she doesn't stop eating ice cream when she knows that she's full. So we diagrammed out that habit loop on the board and said, so your homework this week is to notice where you're getting sucked into that habit loop and just start paying attention to that. And I didn't have to go through the whole thing about how habits are formed. I can just say, okay, remember this. Remember the habit loop from day one. If you don't remember, you can go back to that. So she can have that educational piece from there. We don't waste time there, and we can actually start to dive into where she's actually tripping up. So from a manualized perspective, what we'll start training facilitators to do, and this is something that the Center for Mindfulness has been doing with MBSR programs, for example, for since the early 2000s, where we can train instructors who are very good at embodying the practice, make sure that they are very familiar with the program and how to all of the components of the program, but then run these groups from their own experience of this is when I get caught up in something, whether it's eating or something else, and they can use that experiential learning and their examples from their own lives to help meet people where they're at. We move away and really are discouraging folks from using the sessions as a large psychoeducation format, or even to lead long meditation. So when I talked to the group last night, it was the first group, and I said, notice how we don't have any bells with us. We're not going to be meditating here. And they looked at me, because a lot of them had taken the MBSR course, and they looked at me like, oh, what are we going to actually be doing? This is where we're actually going to be using inquiry to really help people understand their own habit loops. So does that get at your question?
Sorry,
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, and then so then to kind of tie off on that, being that you're so, you're really engaging the use of technology and making this available to people, not just in your area, I'm wondering, are you planning on running kind of facilitator instruction or kind of workshops for professionals online, or will it be held at UMass?
We're hoping to make this, because it's really hard for people to come all the way out here, so we're hoping, and as for those of you that are familiar with the CFM, we've been moving a lot of training online. So what we're envisioning right now, and we'll hope to have it set up even by the summer, we can provide group-based online supervision for folks. We can make sure they have some core training, whether it's MBSR training or something else equivalent, and then also provide online supervision where they're coaching some of their students. We have in-app coaching now, for example, with our smoking program that we'll be rolling out here. We can use those conversations that they're providing with their own clients as a way to provide supervision for them to make sure that they're being trained up and meeting our quality control standards. So I don't have it completely built out yet, but hopefully literally over the next couple of months we'll have that type of training available. And it might even be able to dovetail with a lot of the other mindful eating trainings that are out there, because it's really important that our facilitators can embody these practices, and that's not something that you can learn from a manual. That's something that just takes sitting down and looking at your own mind to do. So there's a way that we're hoping that this will synergize with with a lot of what's already out there, so that we can provide this new type of platform for people who are already trained to facilitate groups, and who can start to facilitate ongoing groups rather than time-limited, say, 8 or 12-week courses.
Okay. We have Summer, your mic is close to your speakers.
Sorry, can you hear now?
Would you like to ask Dr. Brewer a question?
Yes, my question was, I'm going from a hospital setting where clinical nutrition group here, and I just wanted to get some information in terms of screening tools available or questions to decipher if a patient is addicted to food or is something more severe.
It's a really good question. Yeah, that's a really good question and an active area of investigation. So some of my collaborators at UCSF have developed some measures. Alyssa Eppel and her crew have developed some measures around whether people are cravings are related to physiologic hunger or actual eating, and so you can look at some of their work. I'm blanking exactly on the title of that paper, but I know it was published I think in 2014, and I think it's the acronym is RED. But I could be wrong about that. And if you can't find it, you can send me an email, and I'll certainly pull it for you. There are other types of questionnaires that are out there regarding binge eating. For example, Carlos Grillo at Yale has developed some of those questionnaires, as well as folks with him. So differentiating, emotional eating versus more severe pathology is classically done through looking at DSM criteria, but a lot of those are still in flux. So binge eating disorder is relatively new in the lexicon, and so I think we're going to see this field change a bit as we learn more and more about what constitutes addictive type of eating versus other more classic, if we want to call those more classic eating disorders such as anorexia or bulimia. Great question. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any more people with their hand up, but we've had a lot of people type questions in. A lot of interest in your Eat Right Now program, and I think you've covered a lot of how it's going to be available, and so I won't go through those questions. But there was one here. Have you included participants with eating disorders in your trials and/or samples? Really good question. We specifically have not developed this program for things like anorexia or bulimia. Anorexia, as many people know, is a very lethal disorder, and we wanted to start with something that would help people literally change their relationship
to eating based on stress or boredom or emotions, rather than restrictive type eating, and also have not specifically avoided things like bulimia, because I think those it takes a village to treat some of these disorders, and we want to really start with a scope that's manageable. That's I took an oath in medical school to first do no harm. I did not feel comfortable including those very severe pathologies in this type of thing. As we start to understand the limits of this type of training program and what types of supports we can build into them, for example, the in-person facilitation, at some point we might be able to work especially with bulimia, because binge eating, there's a lot of overlap between binge eating disorder and bulimia. And so eventually that might be something that could be served, but that's not something that we've started with. We're trying to start really understand what's going on, understand it mechanistically, make sure it's safe, and then move on from there. So thank you for that very important question.
Great. Here's another one. Have you done research on smoking or eating app-based therapy specifically in low-income populations who have more barriers to healthy eating and quitting smoking?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think of smoking a lot as a tax on the poor. So we found in our clinical studies in person that we've had a wide range of socioeconomic status folks that come into our study. We don't see any difference in folks that are at the lower end versus the higher end in terms of outcomes. So that's good news for us. We're currently in discussion with some potential collaborators to specifically study the smoking program in low socioeconomic status folks. So we hope to be able to do some of that work soon, because I think that that's really critical. And in parallel, we haven't launched our eating research as thoroughly as we have with the smoking, because the app is just coming out, but we hope to be able to do that as well. And I'm guessing, I'm going to infer from this question, as a lot of people know, it's hard for folks of low socioeconomic status to actually get healthy food. So the grocery stores around them tend not to carry good vegetables as much as they do in more affluent societies. So I think there are a number of other barriers societally that we'll need to take into account as we develop these programs, because healthy food's not going to magically appear just because somebody's using a digital therapeutic. So I think we need to think of the whole picture as we start to study and develop these. So that's a great question, and it's a really important one.
Okay. There are a couple of questions that are sort of along this line that I'm not sure if you've really covered. These appear to be from people who would like to individually use the app personally rather than in a clinical situation, and they want to know if it's available for individuals and how much it might cost.
Great question. It will be. It was actually supposed to be launched earlier this week, but it's taken a little while to get through review and for the iTunes store. So we hope that it will be available as early as next week. I think there's going to be an introductory price of $20 a month, if I remember correctly, and the website will be just goeatrightnow.com. If you go to that, there's not going to be an active link where you can sign up because the app isn't available on iTunes yet. But that's that program. People can get that as early as next week. It'll be launched commercially. Additionally, if you go to the resource, I'll just pull it up again. This resource page. Eat Right Now, launchrock.com, you can enter in your contact information, and we'll let you know exactly when it's going to be available and how to get it, or how to make it available to folks. So I'll mention this will be available both on iPhones as well as Android phones.
Great. So here's somebody who works a lot with patients with diabetes and wants to know if this program takes into account diabetes and blood sugar.
Great question. In particular, we're focusing, at least in the step one of this first part of the program, in helping people change their relationship to eating. So we do not focus specifically on diabetes management. Those tools are available through a number of app, web, in-person based trainings. So we're really staying away from that and really helping people move toward what is their relationship to food like and how do they change that. Now what we found was a little confession here. I was a little gung-ho on thinking that we could develop this program and then help people lose weight quickly and this and that they would only need, say, a month or so to go through the program and we'd have great results. What we were finding was that it actually takes a month or 2 months for people just to start really understanding what their relationship to eating is like and to develop some basic mindfulness skills around that. And after that, after several months of really understanding those, then we encourage people to move into applying this to weight loss, diabetes management, et cetera, et cetera. Now what we're finding is along the way people start to trip into it and start to use that information more in a more ready fashion, this information that they already know from, say, diabetes management on their own. And but we're really focusing on just helping people change their relationship to food at the beginning and making sure that that skill is solid before moving on to other things. We want to make sure that they succeed without being overwhelmed with a bunch of information and then fail because they haven't, they feel overwhelmed.
Okay. So here's a question. What is the formal/informal mindfulness practice ratio that is most effective? Do you encourage students to do daily formal practice? Besides RAIN, what informal practices are taught?
It's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to that. And if there were a formula, I think somebody had developed this ratio for positive psychology where if you just think of like 3 positive or 1 negative thing every day, then you're going to be fine. The data didn't end up, that was really exciting to people because it seemed like we could just have these ratios. Turned out not to be as true as everybody was hoping. So in the same way, I wish there were some ratio of informal to formal practice that that we could offer to people, and then we would offer it. What we're finding is that it's more one rule of thumb that I have seen that I will suggest is these short moments many times. So the more people can have short moments of mindfulness throughout their day, whether it's eating mindfully, doing body scan at night, or that's a little more formal practice. So eating mindfully, walking down the street, noticing what's going on. The more they can do this throughout the day, the more they build these skills, so it becomes more habitual. And we've even built into the app these random reminders that come up that it just asks them to check in. And they check in with their emotions, and then it gives them a short mindfulness practice to do, for 10 to 30 seconds. It might be sensory, it might be breath awareness, it might be mindful movement. We've got a bunch of different ones that people can use throughout the day. In addition to that, they can solidify these skills and form a good foundation. So I think of these formal practices as a great way to set a foundation as we go off to sleep or in the morning before we start our day. So breath awareness, body scan, loving kindness, the basic practices that probably most people are familiar with can help set that foundation so that these informal practices can be more effective throughout the day. So I wish there were a ratio. I don't know of one. I don't expect that there will be one that's going to be shown to be effective on a population level because people are so individual. And what I will say is that we've developed a questionnaire that helps people gauge what their behavioral tendency is. This was based on a 5th century commentary on the Pali Canon. I have a Huffington Post blog that my most recent blog is about this, where people can go and learn more about that behavioral tendencies, and they can even take their own quiz to see what their types of tendencies are, and these line up very much with the approach avoid or the fight, flight, freeze that we talked about in terms of habit formation with positive and negative reinforcement. So over time, I think we can start to individualize training based on somebody's own propensities, which also include genetics, and optimize a ratio on an individual basis so that we can have more personalized medicine. That's going to take a couple of years. We're collecting data at the Center for Mindfulness now with this questionnaire so we can start to personalize training, and in the same way we can start to collect these data with our app-based training protocols as well. So it's a great question. It's going to be much more complicated than a simple population-based ratio, But it's part of the gig. Humans are individual, and it's great that we're not so uniform that it's less interesting to interact with each other. So thanks for the question.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're kind of out of time. We've run over a little bit. There was certainly a lot of enthusiasm, probably a few questions that we didn't get to. So if you have a question for Dr. Brewer that we didn't get to, please email us at info@tcme.org, and we'll pass that along to him. Right now, I'd just like to thank Dr. Brewer so much for his time presenting to us today. This will now end our program titled Get Stressed, Eat, Repeat, Why Eating Becomes Habit. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.